The snow in Kovno no longer looked like snow. It lay over the roofs and streets in thick, tired layers, not clean or bright, but bruised by soot and ash, stamped thin by boots and wagon wheels until it resembled old gauze pressed over a wound that everyone had stopped trying to heal. From the small attic window where she sat, Hanna Korin could see almost all of Village Ampol, or what was left of it. Once she had known the names of shops and streets, of neighbors and traders and the baker who always sang under his breath. Now those names existed only inside her head like words in a language nobody spoke aloud anymore. Below her, the ghetto exhaled in slow, shallow breaths. A horse's hooves clopped weakly against slush. A cart creaked, the wheels protesting against ruts now frozen, now mush again. Somewhere someone coughed, a dry, masculine cough that turned suddenly wet at the end. Doors opened, not with casual familiarity, but with that particular sound of caution. The careful turning of a handle, the pause, the listening before committing to visibility. Hanna watched it all without moving. Her fingers lay still on the gray wool of her skirt. Her knees were pressed together, ankles tucked backward beneath the rickety wooden chair that had once belonged to her grandfather. The chair had been polished once, long before the war, by hands that believed in the value of such small rituals. Now its surface was dull, scratched, and mottled with burns from candles that had melted down too low when no one could afford to waste wax. She heard footsteps on the stairs long before they reached the door. Soft, dragging, familiar. The footsteps of someone who carried more memory than strength. Her mother. Hanna. The voice floated up through the thin boards. "It's time." "Almost," Hanna answered, though she did not move yet. Silence, then the quiet sigh of someone who had stopped expecting to be obeyed instantly. Once her mother's voice had been brisk and bright, full of direction. Once it had said things like, "Hanna, grab your scarf, we'll be late for lessons," or, "Don't run with scissors, you'll cut yourself," or, "Careful with the knives when you help with the vegetables." Now it mostly said, "It's time. Time for soup thin as worry. Time for counting bread. Time for roll call. Time for another day that looked like all the others." Hanna let her gaze drift away from the street, toward the faint reflection in the window pane. A girl looked back at her, but not the one she remembered. This one had sharper angles, cheekbones more pronounced, jawline more visible, eyes sunk deeper into their sockets. Her hair, once thick and dark and braided carefully every morning, now hung roughly in a single plait, a few strands escaping like rebels. There were hollows at her temples that hadn't been there last winter, and a faint tension around her mouth even at rest, as if she'd forgotten how to let her lips soften completely. The most unsettling change was not any of those things. It was the stillness. The Hanna in the window did not fidget. Her hands did not play with her braid, did not drum fingers against glass, did not adjust her collar or smooth her skirt. She sat as though she had been carved there, as much a part of the attic as the cracked beam above her head. She blinked slowly. Outside, a German truck rumbled by, its engine a low growl that made the window vibrate. She saw the gray-green uniforms in the back. The helmets, the black boots, the rifles upright like an extra row of stiff metal-backed men. The red armband with the black hooked symbol flashed once as the vehicle turned a corner near the outer fence. She didn't look away. When the truck disappeared, the sound stayed, lingering in the air as if the motor had left an echo behind. "Hanna." Her mother's voice again, closer now at the attic door. The handle turned with a soft click. "We have to go to the workshop." "I know," Hanna said. She rose in a single, controlled motion. No stretching, no groaning, no small theatrics of discomfort. The chair barely scraped the floor. She reached for the coat hanging on the single crooked nail by the door. It had once been a nice coat, dark blue with a row of neat buttons and a collar lined with soft fur. Her father had bought it on a cold November afternoon the year before the war, standing in a shop that smelled of leather and strong tea, arguing with the owner about prices that now seemed like numbers from someone else's dream. Now the coat was frayed at the cuffs, the fur collar matted and thin. A yellow fabric star, poorly cut and clumsily stitched, sat crookedly on her chest. The threads pulled at the wool where her mother had sewn it on in shaking haste the first week they arrived in the ghetto. She slipped her arms into the sleeves and fastened the top two buttons. The lower ones no longer closed properly. Her body had shrunk. The coat had warped. The shapes didn't align the way they used to. As she reached for the last button, her fingers brushed something hidden beneath the lining. A small stiffness, a familiar edge. Her hand stayed there just for a heartbeat. No longer. Then she let the coat fall closed and lowered her arm, the movement smooth, unhurried. Her mother watched her from the doorway. Leah Korin had aged a decade in 2 years. Lines radiated from her eyes like cracks in a glass that had been dropped and caught halfway. Her hair, once pinned up neatly, now escaped its bun in erratic wisps that made her look perpetually startled. The blue of her eyes, Hanna's blue, had dulled not in color but in light. Yet there was something in the way she looked at her daughter now that hadn't been there before the fences went up. A careful distance, as if Hanna were made of something fragile and sharp at the same time. "Did you sleep at all?" Leah asked. "A little," Hanna replied. There was no point lying. Her mother had heard her moving in the night, pacing silently between the mattress and the window, listening to something no one else could hear, the rhythm of the ghetto's fear. "Eat." Leah held out a small piece of bread, thinner than Hanna's hand. "You'll faint at the machine if you don't." Hanna took the bread. It was hard along the edges, softer in the middle. She broke it into 3 pieces, calculating without thinking. One small piece for now, one to tuck away for later, one. She looked at her mother and saw the faint tremor in the older woman's mouth. Hanna pressed the middle piece back into Leah's palm. Her mother started to protest, then stopped. They had had this argument before too many times and there was nothing new to say. They walked down the stairs together, each step familiar. The sag in the 3rd board, the creak in the 7th, the longer pause on the landing where the window had been broken by a rifle but the previous autumn and patched with newspaper and tape. On one of the walls, beneath a smear of dust and smoke, a faded photograph still clung stubbornly. It showed a group of children at a skating rink, cheeks red from the cold, woolen hats pulled low, scarves flying behind them. In the center, arms outstretched for balance, was a younger Hanna, before. Her hair was braided neatly. She wore a white scarf. Her mouth was open in a smile so unguarded it felt indecent now, like seeing someone undressed in public. She remembered that day vividly. The sharp, clean bite of cold air in her lungs, the sound of blades scoring the ice, the flares of sunlight, the distant music crackling from loudspeakers. "Don't skate so close to the edge," her father had called from the sidelines, laughing. "The ice is thinner there." She had laughed back, fearless, gliding closer anyway just to feel the slight give beneath her feet. Edges had never frightened her. Now the only ice left in Kovno seemed to be the thin sheets forming in water buckets overnight. They stepped out into the street. The cold hit her face like a familiar slap. The ghetto buildings squatted close together, their walls scarred by neglect. Peeling paint, boarded windows, slogans scratched away and painted over again. The fences rose beyond them, tall and topped with barbed wire that gleamed faintly in the winter light. German and Lithuanian guards stood at intervals, their eyes scanning, not so much watching individuals as marking patterns. Gatherings that might be crowds, movements that looked like running, shadows that didn't align with expected pathways. Hanna lowered her gaze just enough to show obedience without surrendering awareness. She had become very good at seeing without appearing to look. Life before had also required observation, though of a different kind. In the kitchen in their old apartment, she had stood beside her mother as knives sliced effortlessly through onions, carrots, potatoes. Her small hands had learned to copy the movements. How to hold the handle, how to let the blade fall with its own weight, how to guide vegetables into uniform pieces. Her father had joked, "Our little surgeon," when he saw her precision. "You'll cut yourself if you rush," her mother had warned. He almost never did. The knife had felt natural in her hand, not as a weapon. It had never been that, but as an extension of intention. Cutting clean, straight, without waste. Separating what needed separating. Dividing what could not remain whole in that form. Now there were no proper knives in their room. They had been confiscated like radios, metal pots, silver candlesticks. But Hanna's fingers had not forgotten. They walked past an empty lot where a house had once stood. Only the foundation remained, a dark rectangle filled with snow and broken bricks. Someone had drawn shapes in the white, circles, lines, names. Children's work easily erased by the next wind. They passed a gate where a German soldier stood smoking, his rifle slung carelessly over his shoulder. His breath fogged the air. Ash fell from his cigarette onto the snow, melting tiny holes. Hanna heard the faint rasp of his inhale, the almost subvocal hum as he exhaled. He was bored. Bored men were dangerous. Not because they always acted but because, if they did, it would be sudden, impulsive and without pattern. She adjusted her pace almost imperceptibly so they passed while his head was turned toward a distant sound. Another truck, another order shouted. They reached the workshop barracks at the end of the street. Outside, a crude sign in German announced its purpose. Inside, the air was warmer but not kinder. The heat came from the bodies pressed together, from the motors of sewing machines, from the breath of dozens of people working in tight rows. The smell here was a mixture of a machine oil, a damp wool, the faint iron of blood from pricked fingers, sweat held in by too many layers of clothing. Hanna took her place at her machine. It had a name stamped into its metal body, Singer, once decorative, now ironic. She ran her fingers lightly along the edge of the table, feeling the roughness where the varnish had worn away. The supervisor, a Lithuanian man with a mustache that always seemed a moment away from falling off his face, walked between the rows, eyeing the lines of stitches. Faster, he barked. Always faster. The army doesn't wait. It never occurred to him that neither did hunger, nor infection, nor grief. Hanna's feet found the pedal with practiced ease. The needle began to rise and fall, a silver blur, punching thread through fabric in a relentless rhythm. Hands moved on either side of her, thin hands, red-knuckled hands, trembling hands. The woman to her left, Rivka, had two bandaged fingers where the machine had taken a toll the previous week. The boy to her right was no older than 12 and struggled to keep his seams straight. Hanna's work, by contrast, was clean. Her lines were precise. Corners crisp. She almost never broke a thread. Her needle moved as steadily as a metronome, the fabric feeding through with no sudden jerks. It wasn't talent. It was focus. While she worked, she listened. The machines had their own language, each one with a distinct pitch, a particular wobble or whine. She could tell which belt was loose, which needle slightly bent, which motor would fail by the end of the week. She also heard the world beyond the walls. Boots on cobblestones. Shouts at the gate. The distant clatter of something heavy being unloaded. Every sound entered her mind, was weighed compared to previous days. Patterns formed. Deviations stood out like tears in fabric. "Why are you always so quiet?" Rivka whispered once, during a rare moment when the supervisor's attention shifted to another row. Hanna didn't look up from her stitching. "There's too much noise already," she answered. Rivka rolled her eyes. "You sound like an old woman." Hanna's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Oldness, she thought, was not about years. It was about how many times you had been forced to understand something you didn't want to know. Their work that day was uniform collars, rows and rows of identical shapes in gray fabric. The color had become a kind of visual fog in her mind, always present, never interesting. At midday they were given soup, a thin liquid with a few ghost-like strands of cabbage floating near the surface. Hanna sipped it slowly, feeling the warmth slide down her throat, pooling briefly in her stomach before fading. She pretended not to see the way Rivka eyed her portion, the flicker of shame when their gazes met. Hanna tilted her bowl slightly toward her. "Take the rest." "No, I can't." "Yes, you can," Hanna said in that flat, unarguable tone she had developed over the past year. Not harsh. Not kind. Simply final. Rivka took it, hands shaking. In the late afternoon, the light through the grimy windows shifted from thin white to a thicker yellow-gray, the color of a bruise healing badly. The machines were stopped. Tools were put away. People gathered their ration cards, their coats, their small bundles of personal belongings. "Tomorrow," the supervisor said, "we start on a new order. Something special. For the Reich." He said Reich, like a priest might say God, with a mix of reverence and fear. On the way home, the streets felt narrower than that morning. The fences seemed closer, though they hadn't moved. The guard rotations had shifted. Hanna counted unfamiliar faces, new angles of vigilance. Her mother walked beside her, slower now, her breath slightly ragged. The cold seemed to cling to Leah more stubbornly these days. "They said we might get more bread next week," Leah said suddenly, as if needing to fill the silence with something other than the sound of mortality. "If the quotas are met." Hanna did not respond. She knew by now that might in the ghetto was a word as insubstantial as steam. They reached their building and climbed the stairs. On the landing, Hanna's gaze flicked automatically to the photograph on the wall. The children on the ice looked back at her from another lifetime. Ever since the ghetto she had not stepped on ice again. There were no rinks here, no polished surfaces, no tooth-like scratch of blades. But she still remembered how it felt to glide, to cut through cold without resistance. At the attic door, Leah touched her daughter's sleeve. "I worry about you," she said. Hanna turned the handle. "Don't," she replied softly. "Worry wastes energy." They went inside. The room smelled of boiled cabbage and candle smoke. In the far corner, on the crate that served as a table, lay the small bundle that Hanna always checked first on returning home. A roll of fabric scraps, a bent spoon, a piece of broken mirror, a spool of coarse thread. And next to it, wrapped carefully in cloth, was the other thing. She didn't touch it yet. Instead, she sat on the mattress, unlaced her boots, and flexed her toes until feeling returned fully. Her mother busied herself with the pot, stirring a stew so thin it barely deserved the name. The sound of the spoon against the metal was rhythmic, almost soothing. "Hanna," Leah said without turning around. "Do you ever think about after?" "After what?" "After this." Her mother's back rose and fell with the words. "After the war. After the gates. After." Her voice trailed off, defeated by the size of the word after. Hanna looked at the ceiling. "No," she said after a while. "Why not?" "Because if I plan for after, I might make a mistake in now." Leah turned to look at her. There was no cruelty in the answer. That made it harder to bear. Outside, night settled over Kovno like a heavy, reluctant blanket. The sounds of the ghetto changed. Fewer carts, more muffled conversations, the occasional sharp cry cut short quickly. The distant, controlled bark of a German command punctuated the darkness from time to time. Hanna waited until her mother lay down, exhausted, her breath evening out into shallow sleep. Only then did she move toward the crate. She lifted the cloth. Beneath it lay a small metal object no longer than her hand, wrapped in yet another layer of fabric. She unfolded it carefully, revealing the blade. It was not a full knife. Those had been taken long ago. This was the broken half of one, the handle missing, only the steel left, edges kissed again and again by whatever crude sharpening she could manage against stone and metal over the months. It was clean. Always clean. She held it between her fingers, feeling the weight, the balance. Her thumb slid lightly along the duller spine, never touching the edge. She did not smile. She did not tremble. In another life this might have been a tool for cooking, for crafts, for school projects. In this life it was simply potential. She turned it once, watching how the faint light caught on the metal. The blade did not reflect her face fully, only fragments, sliced and scattered. In the silence of the attic, with the muffled world breathing below her, Hanna Korin sat alone with the blade that made no sound when it moved. The girl with the silent blade. Not yet used. Not yet named. But the edges of her life were already rearranging themselves around it. And somewhere in the workshops and offices of Kovno, papers were being signed, orders stamped, plans drawn. A new German factory schedule, a new deportation list, a new special unit requirement. Changes. Shifts in pattern. Things that most people would only notice when it was too late. Hanna did not know what, not yet. But she could feel it, the way a hand feels the grain of wood even in darkness. Something was coming. And when it arrived, she would need more than silent endurance. She would need precision. She wrapped the blade again, tucking it back under the cloth, under the crate, under the fragile illusion of normality. Then she lay down beside her mother, eyes open in the dark, listening to the ghetto breathe. Above them, snow slid off a rooftop with a soft, heavy thump. Below them, far off, a dog barked once, twice, then stopped. And in the narrow, shrinking space between one heartbeat and the next, she began, quietly, methodically, to plan. But after she whispered those words, something else happened. Something so small it could have been coincidence, yet so precise it felt like intention. The distant barking stopped. Not faded. Not replaced. Stopped. As if someone had pressed a hand over reality itself and smothered the sound into stillness. Hanna did not smile. She did not react. She simply closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to listen inward, as if the silence outside had awakened a deeper quiet inside her. Her breaths slowed even more, to the point that they were nearly imperceptible, and there came a moment, brief, fleeting, where she could not feel fear, only clarity. A clarity that had weight, not emotion. She opened her eyes again. Below, through the darkness, she could see faint movements, shadows passing beneath lamp posts, officers signaling with fingers rather than voices, dogs pacing but now uneasy, sniffing not forward, but upward as if something above their comprehension disrupted instinct. That was when Hanna finally spoke, just 3 syllables, fragile as frost, yet strangely steady. "They're close." Her voice wasn't directed at anyone, not even herself. It was an observation the same way one might note that water boils or glass breaks. A truth that didn't require belief. She remained seated until her body sensed, not heard, the shift in energy outside. A tightening, a convergence, as though the night itself had turned its face toward the ghetto and watched back. Only then did she lie down beside her mother, who shivered even in sleep. Hanna placed a hand gently near her mother's wrist, not touching, just close enough to monitor the rhythm, not of pulse but of tension. The tremor in Leah's muscles was faint but constant, like an echo that refused to fade. Hanna closed her eyes, not to dream but to wait. Morning arrived without birds. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. When they stepped back outside for roll call, people looked more exhausted than the day before. Not physically but mentally collapsed, as if sleep had given no refuge. Hanna noticed new things in their faces. Micro-twitches near the eyes. Split-second glances toward corners. Fear that looked more like anticipation than dread. Someone had been taken in the night. Everyone knew, even if no one spoke. A man near the front muttered while rubbing his temples, "They don't hunt unless they smell something." Another replied, barely audible, "Maybe it wasn't a man. Could have been a message." Hanna blinked slowly, her eyes tracking a single snowflake drifting sideways rather than downward. She watched it land on a boot, one not belonging to a prisoner. The officer attached to that boot stood taller today, posture sharpened, eyes more alert. Not crueler, just more aware. He scanned the crowd repeatedly, not searching for an escaped prisoner, nor for contraband. He was searching for something that didn't fit. Hanna kept her eyes lowered until she sensed exactly when he would stop looking in her direction. Not before, not after, but in the precise second that ensured no visual connection. Her mother mistook this for obedience. Rivka, who stood further left, did not. Their eyes met only once, but that was enough. Rivka mouthed silently, "You feel it." "Not not you saw. You feel." It was no accusation. It was recognition. Later, in the workshop, Rivka sat 2 stations closer than usual. She worked slowly that day, deliberately falling behind. Something no sane person did willingly. Falling behind meant punishment, and punishment here was not symbolic. Hanna stitched gloves with identical precision, but her attention, her real attention, measured changes around her like invisible rulers. Footsteps outside hallway equals heavier, faster, officer approaching. Metal latch click equals 4 seconds earlier than routine inspection, unplanned. Girl 2 seats away equals breathing unevenly, fear unrelated to guard presence. Supervisor's right hand equals tapping desk, sign of tension, not boredom. None of these were random fragments. They formed a structure like threads in fabric. Rivka suddenly stopped sewing, her needle frozen mid-air. Hanna sensed the moment before seeing it. A sharp inhale, an almost inaudible gasp, and the metallic scent of blood. Not dripping, not dramatic, just a small wound on a finger. The supervisor turned instantly. Too instantly. His reaction time did not match the action. He hadn't seen the injury, he had been already watching. Rivka looked terrified. Not because she might be punished, but because she now understood something deeper. He wasn't watching for mistakes. He was watching for outliers. And she had tried to test Hanna by proximity. Before the supervisor could speak, Hanna lifted her own needle, snapped the thread with her teeth, and pricked her own fingertip on purpose. A bright bead of red rose instantly. She held the finger up as if nothing unusual had occurred. The supervisor frowned, irritated, no longer sure who had triggered his suspicion cue. He moved on. Rivka stared with parted lips, barely blinking. You did that for me?" Hanna didn't reply. Words were too visible. Actions left fewer fingerprints. That evening, while others ate ration broth or bartered stolen crumbs, Hanna used her time differently. She sat near a wall, eyes not on people but on shadows of their movements, stored as mental sequences. Her ability wasn't strength. It wasn't luck. It wasn't even supernatural. It was hyper-pattern recognition. Emotional microshifts. Auditory rhythm deviation. Environmental mathematics. Predictive silence. Danger mapping. Her mind operated like someone solving equations nobody else saw existed. She didn't know it was extraordinary. To her, it was survival logic. But to anyone watching closely, it was terrifying. That night, as wind scratched weakly against wooden frames, Rivka appeared outside Hanna's attic door, out of breath, eyes wide. "Hanna," she whispered, "they're coming tonight. Not for escapees. For someone who sees too much." Hanna didn't look alarmed. Just thoughtful. "How do you know?" she asked, voice flat. Rivka swallowed. "Because they questioned me. About you." Hanna blinked once. So, unhurried. Then she asked with eerie calm, "Did you lie well?" Silence. Rivka nodded, but Hanna knew instantly it hadn't been perfect. She knew because Rivka's left hand trembled not with fear, but with anticipation, meaning she had not lied confidently but desperately. Hanna exhaled once, quiet, thin, almost invisible, and whispered 3 words that did not match her age. "Then we wait." Her tone held no panic. Only strategy. Not childish instinct. Not survival chance. Calculation. The snow outside thickened, muffling the world like cotton stuffed into the mouth of history. Far away, boots began aligning into patterns again. Not random patrol. Selection. The night that followed was not a night. It was a threshold, a space that no longer felt like hours but something heavier, like time had thickened into oil and coated everything with a texture that resisted breath. Hanna did not sleep. Neither did her thoughts. Rivka had returned to her own sleeping space, but not before whispering through cracked lips, "If they look at you too long, don't move. They chase movement." The advice echoed not as fear but as confirmation, a puzzle piece Hanna already possessed. She sat with her back against the attic wall, knees drawn close, coat still on, fingers resting near its inner stitching where the silent blade remained hidden. Her mother slept fitfully beside her, occasionally gasping through half-dreamed terror. Hanna watched the door. Not in fear. In preparation. Morning came dull, colorless, without gradient. Dawn simply appeared, like a breath someone had forgotten not to inhale. Roll call sounded harsher this time, not louder, just loaded. Even the guards' boots seemed to strike the ground with different rhythm. Shorter intervals, narrower spacing, tactical formation rather than routine passage. Hanna and Leah stepped outside like all others, merging into a human mass that felt less like a population and more like inventory. Guards watched not faces but reactions. Who avoided eye contact too quickly. Who held it too long. Who blinked too much. Who didn't blink enough. Hanna did not look at the officers directly, but she could feel where their gazes landed. Each angle, each shift, each microsecond of hesitation. Their pattern today was wrong. This was not patrol. This was selection by suspicion. A Lithuanian auxiliary officer pointed suddenly at an old man in the 3rd row, accusing him of hoarding food. The man trembled, insisting he owned nothing but memory and bone. No one defended him. No one dared. He was dragged away, still pleading. But Hanna sensed something chilling. The officers already knew the accusation was false. It wasn't about guilt. It was about response variables. They were testing fear elasticity. How quickly would the crowd break? Where would the silence fracture? Whose eyes betrayed too much? If they couldn't find an obvious threat, they would create one. Later in the workshop, tension manifested not in noise but in stillness. Even the sewing machines sounded more mechanical than usual, their rhythm less like synchronized work and more like a ticking countdown under fabric. Hanna worked at her usual speed, but her hands began to tremble, not from fear but from internal conflict. She could tell something was coming but not its trigger point. Rivka hadn't spoken all morning. Her eyes were red but not from tears, from extreme alertness, the kind that dries emotion into dust. Suddenly the workshop door swung open. An officer entered, not the usual guard but an investigator type, the kind whose uniform was immaculate, boots polished, gaze structured, manner quiet. Quiet meant dangerous. Silent brutality was far more strategic than shouted commands. It allowed the mind to become the tormentor. He surveyed the room like a librarian searching for a misplaced volume. Then he spoke. "Work will continue. Eyes on your task. When your number is called, stand. Do not speak. Do not argue. Do not hesitate." He unrolled a small list, though his eyes barely flicked toward it. It wasn't a list of guilt. It was a list of targets. The room stiffened. Hands blurred with renewed frantic sewing, not to save stitches but to save existence. He called the first number. A woman rose, terrified, barely breathing. He stared at her for 11 seconds, then dismissed her back. It wasn't selection. It was profiling. Then his voice cut through air like a scalpel. Number 57. Hanna froze briefly, then stood, spine straight, chin low, eyes neutral. Her mother gasped behind her, too quietly for anyone but Hanna to hear. The officer circled her with slow, intentional steps, observing the subtle lines of her coat, the rhythm of her breathing, the stillness of her shoulders. He leaned in slightly, close enough for Hanna to smell polished leather, cold air and faint tobacco, but not close enough to seem inappropriate. "You don't fear me the way they do." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation disguised as diagnosis. Hanna remained silent, gaze floor fixed. Children tremble. Children cry. Children shake. He paused, measuring. "You are not trembling." There was no safe answer to that. He lifted one finger beneath her chin, forcing her face upward. Her heart rate did not spike. His nostrils flared very faintly, not anger but recognition of anomaly. "Tell me, what exactly are you?" His voice wasn't cruel. It was curious. Curiosity was worse than cruelty. Curiosity persisted. She let 3 seconds pass, long enough to appear hesitant, not defiant. She whispered. His expression did not change. He dismissed her. But not from suspicion. From observation stage 1. She had been tagged. Over the next 2 days, patterns changed subtly but undeniably. Her station was moved closer to the door. A guard lingered specifically near her side. Requests for tools near her were delayed. Rivka was quietly reassigned 3 tables away. Children were told to avoid unusual behaviors. Whispers spread, not through words but glances. People did not avoid Hanna, they watched her. Humans feared wolves but studied omens. The investigator returned. This time he did not speak to the room. He spoke only to her. In front of everyone. "Remove your coat." A collective shiver rippled through the workshop. Everyone understood the implication. They believed she was hiding something. Hanna slid the buttons free. Slowly, not as delay but as control, preserving the illusion of cooperation rather than fear. When she lifted the coat from her shoulders, the small hidden blade stayed inside. She did not move wrong. She let the coat fall in a way that kept the weighted lining facing inward, making it nearly impossible to feel or see, especially if handled casually. The officer patted the coat but not well. Not thoroughly. He assumed she would panic and reveal what he sought. She did not. His eyes narrowed, not disappointed but intrigued. Interesting. He returned the coat and turned away, ordering everyone back to work. But that single word was no mercy. It was prelude. That night after curfew, boots thundered through the ghetto, not in marching rhythm but interrogation rhythm. Fast stop, like a pulse searching for a vein. Doors were thrown open. Children cried silently. Mothers bit lips until they bled rather than scream. Then came the heavy fist against their attic door. Leah stepped backward, hands shaking as she tried to form prayers that her memory could no longer complete. They kicked the door in. 4 men entered. The investigator stood behind them. He held contraband, not torn, not dirty, intentionally planted and too pristine to be real. Forged ration slips and a small map fragment. Items she had never touched. "We found these hidden within your floorboards. You have been aiding escape preparations." It didn't matter that she had not. It mattered that they needed a threat. Leah threw herself forward to defend her daughter, clutching Hanna's arm as if bloodline alone could shield her. "She's only a girl. She does nothing wrong. She barely speaks." The officer leaned in slowly, face cold and unreadable. "Exactly." He signaled. 2 men seized Hanna's arms and dragged her from the room. She did not scream, not because she didn't feel fear, but because screaming was a variable that worsened outcomes. Her mother screamed instead, loud, broken, animalistic, until a rifle but silenced her with brutal force. Hanna did not look back. Looking back meant attachment. Attachment meant leverage. They locked her in an underground holding room, a stone space used not for torture but for psychological erosion. No light, no warmth, no separation from dripping water sounds, No sense of hours passing. She sat, spine against the wall, listening to guards' boots above, keys turning far away, muffled cries in distant rooms, rats chewing wood or fabric, wind howling through cracks, pipes breathing air like lungs under strain. Time loosened its meaning. Reality tilted. She wrapped her arms around herself, but not for comfort, for containment. Her mind began to construct patterns even in the absence of visible stimuli. 3 drips, pause, 2 drips, longer pause. Boots halt, cough, door silence. Keys jingling, metal slap, retreating steps. It was data. She memorized all of it. Most people trapped in isolation lost track of time. Hanna measured it. Her breathing became softer, slower. Almost inaudible. The goal was not patience. The goal was undetectability. She fell into a state between waking and dissociation, something neither dream nor hallucination, where thought floated separate from body. If I do not exist loudly, I cannot be broken loudly. Hours, maybe days passed. Her mother did not come. Rivka did not come. No one came. Finally the door opened. Light didn't fill the room, it stabbed it. Her pupils dilated instantly, not from pain but from recalibration. 2 guards yanked her upright. She didn't resist. Resistance seemed expected. Giving them nothing denied them data. They dragged her down a hallway that smelled of mold, disinfectant, old metal, and fear that had lived too long to be fresh. At the end of the hall was a larger room, lit by a single lamp, where the investigator waited beside a table containing 3 objects. A pencil. A torn children's book. A small wooden block. The simplicity was more chilling than blades. He motioned for her to sit. She did. You are not like the others, he said calmly. So we will test you. He slid the wooden block toward her first. Stack it. Then stop when I say stop. He stacked it. He said, stop. She stopped instantly, without hesitation, without delay. His eyes narrowed. Next he handed the torn children's book. Open to the page that scares you. She did not flip through the pages. She opened directly to a page with an illustration of a wolf hiding behind trees. He inhaled slowly. Not shock. Documentation. Finally he placed the pencil before her. Break it. He did not touch it. He repeated. Break the pencil. Hanna lifted her gaze and answered, soft, steady, without malice. Things should only break if they cannot bend. He froze, not in anger but in complete cognitive interruption. Child prisoners did not speak in philosophical logic. Adults barely did. He leaned in, whispering, who taught you to think like that? She blinked. Nobody taught me. I notice. The officer straightened slowly. And then he did something even more horrifying than shouting, beating, or threatening. He smiled. Not kindly. With discovery. You're not a threat because you resist. You're a threat because you adapt. He stood, signaling one guard. Prepare her for relocation. The guard hesitated. Transport or disposal? The officer's smile deepened. Observation. Hanna watched silently. Transport meant experimentation. Observation meant survival without identity. Disposal meant nothingness. She swallowed once. Then she whispered, barely audible but intentional. You're making a mistake. He turned. Why? She didn't blink. Because you think I am alone. His smile vanished. For the first time the investigator's expression fractured. Not into panic, not into anger, but into a rare, momentary lapse of certainty, like a perfect calculation suddenly questioning the possibility of an unnoticed variable. He took one slow step forward, studying her with a gaze no longer clinical but penetrative, as though he could peel her mind apart piece by piece if he stared long enough. Alone, he repeated quietly, is the only state possible in this place. His voice was confident again, but his eyes weren't. Hanna didn't reply immediately. She simply watched him, not like a child looking at an adult, but like an analyst watching a subject react to a stimulus. Her silence became part of the dialogue, not an absence of speech but a deliberate instrument. Finally she responded. You don't understand this place the way you think you do. The guard beside him scoffed. She's destabilizing, she uses words like traps. But Hanna didn't look at the guard. She kept her gaze on the investigator and only him. You look for threats in noise, she whispered. You never learn to look for threats in quiet. A subtle chill permeated the room, like the air had shrunk a degree without moving. The investigator exhaled slowly, adopted composure again and gestured toward the guard. Move her. I want her in holding room B instead. The guard hesitated again, an almost imperceptible pause, as if questioning whether it was safe to even touch a child who didn't behave like one. Hanna was taken through a new corridor, long, narrow, with walls more polished than the previous ones, where footsteps echoed longer, suggesting deeper insulation. The air wasn't freezing here, just cold enough to preserve compliance. They stopped at a heavy black door. Holding room B was different. There were no chains, no floor drain, no hooks, no visible restraints. Just a metal chair bolted to the floor, and a single lamp hanging so low it felt like it might descend and interrogate on its own. They sat her there, wrists unbound, legs free. Freedom in a place of captivity was never mercy. It was bait. The investigator entered alone this time. He dismissed the guard with a wave and locked the door himself. No audience. No witnesses. No noise. He circled the room once before speaking. Who told you to say that? Voice calm. Tone forensic. Hanna didn't blink. No one told me. I observe. His jaw tightened. Observe what exactly? Weak points, she answered simply. The silence that followed was no longer interrogation. It was acknowledgement. He moved closer, pulling a small notebook from his pocket, not standard issue. The cover was worn leather, creased at the corners, pages yellowed not from time but use. He opened it, revealing tiny, dense handwriting, not military reports but personal deductions. I have seen your type once before, he murmured half to himself. Hanna waited. People who don't break where others break. People whose minds shape themselves to survive conditions everyone else dies in. He looked up at her. Survival like that is rare. Hanna tilted her head slightly. Survival is not rare, she responded. Only noticing is rare. A flicker of something resembling troubled fascination crossed his face. He tapped the notebook with a gloved finger. Those who notice too much become disruptive variables. Unpredictable. Unfit for containment models. Hanna lowered her gaze, not submissively but thoughtfully. Containment fails when you misunderstand the subject's nature. His breath caught so subtly it could have been mistaken for fatigue. She continued, voice flat but controlled. You think survival is a reaction. But it's a design. He stared at her as if she had spoken the secret language of cognitive architecture. And then she said something even more destabilizing. I see the way you think. The investigator stepped back. He did not expect a child to understand metaperception. Explain that, he demanded. But Hanna did not obey demands. She obeyed timing. You don't hurt people unless it answers a question. You don't fear rebellion. You fear variables. You don't test for guilt. You test for deviation. The notebook slipped slightly in his hand. She concluded. You are not hunting disobedience. You are hunting patterns you cannot model. The investigator finally sat, not like an interrogator but like a man suddenly upgraded to pupil. Holding room B became her new cage, but also her new theater. For the next 2 days she was not tortured. She was measured. Different men came to observe. Some wore uniforms, others coats, others plain shirts. Some took notes on paper, others only in their minds. Some studied her silently, others tried provoking her with questions like, do you dream? Do you hate? What would you save if fire came? What makes people predictable? What sound scares you? Hanna answered only when it changed outcomes. When she didn't answer, they thought she didn't know. The truth was far more dangerous. She answered only when it allowed data inversion, turning observers into subjects. When one man asked, what is the difference between fear and obedience? She responded, fear ends when danger ends. Obedience ends when awareness begins. The man lowered his pen and didn't come back again. Another tried a different approach. What would you do to survive? She replied, the question is wrong. Survival is not something you do. It is something you become. He left with visible sweat on his brow. By the 4th day the investigator returned. His tone was slightly different. Less command, more negotiation. Do you want freedom? He asked. Hanna studied his posture, his micro-movements, his breathing cadence. His body told her what his words did not. He wasn't asking. He was offering an experiment. Everyone wants freedom, she said. He leaned forward. Not everyone will do what it requires. She didn't blink. Most people misunderstand what freedom is. He waited. Freedom isn't leaving this place, she whispered. Freedom is leaving their control. For the first time, the investigator looked unsure of whose side he was on. Meanwhile, outside holding room B, the ghetto was changing. The guards noticed whispered behavior shifts. Prisoners began walking in coordinated rhythm. People exchanged meaningful glances, not panic. Conversations shortened to single-coded gestures. Mothers and children swapped sleeping rotations. Food distribution lines realigned silently. Children began sitting back-to-back in corners. No one waited near windows. No one slept near doorways. No message had been spoken. But something was being communicated. Rivka noticed it first. The patterns were Hanna-like. No one had seen or heard Hanna since she was taken, but her way of thinking had begun to infect the collective. It wasn't rebellion. It was mental adaptation protocols spreading. A quiet revolution of perception shift. On the 7th day of observation, the investigator entered holding room B carrying not a notebook but a box. He placed it on the floor between them and sat down, knees bent, abandoning superiority stance. Inside this box, he began, are 3 objects, like before. But this time, I want you to pick the one that means you understand what happens next. Hanna did not move. You may approach the box. She rose slowly, stepped forward, kneeled silently and opened it. Inside were a small iron key, a folded strip of barbed wire, a single matchstick. She stared at them for several seconds, eyes unfocused, as if reading invisible text around the objects rather than the objects themselves. Then she whispered, "You want to know whether my mind escapes, conquers, or destroys?" The investigator's breath caught. Yes. She closed the box gently, then sat back without taking anything. He frowned. You refuse to choose? No, she answered. I already chose. Which? None. Silence thickened. Explain. A key opens a door someone else built. Barbed wire wounds both sides of a boundary. Fire draws attention. She looked directly at him. The correct answer is to change the rules, not play inside them. He stared at her as if she had become the architect of a system he once believed he controlled. Then she added, freedom is not chosen. It must be engineered. The investigator stood abruptly, not furious but shaken by realization. He paced once, twice, then pressed both hands flat on the metal table, leaning forward, his voice low and strained. Do you know what they will do to you if they decide you are unpredictable? Yes, she replied. And you still refuse cooperation? She tilted her head. You think I am refusing? I am building conditions. He stared. Conditions for what? Phase shift. A whisper. A prophecy. A threat. A promise. He stepped back in disbelief. Children do not think like this. Children do not survive here, she answered. That night he didn't return to his quarters. He stayed in the hallway outside holding room B, pacing in silence, unable to shake the sense that keeping her contained would not protect the Reich. It would arm it with the very variable it feared. At dawn he entered once more. No guards. No notebook. No box. He spoke softly. If I walk you out of here, you will not run. Not a question. A projection. Hanna responded with equal quiet. If you walk me out of here, I will not need to run. Why not? Because by the time we reach the door, you won't be my enemy anymore. Something in him broke then. Not loyalty, not ideology, but the illusion that control equaled order. He removed his gloves. Hands trembling. Not from fear of her, but fear of what she represented. Meanwhile, inside the ghetto, movements had become perfectly synchronized. Not as rebellion but as a new behavioral equilibrium. Enough that guards began reporting. They look like they're thinking the same thing. They changed formation patterns on their own. They predict our patrol shifts. No one panics anymore. It's unnatural. Rumors reached the investigator. The ghetto is becoming quiet. They aren't frightened. They're coordinated. Coordinated. A word commanders hated. Not violent. Not rebellious. Aligned. Pattern recognition was contagious. And Hanna had become patient zero. Back in holding room B, the investigator sat on the floor across from her, no longer postured as interrogator. There are 3 outcomes, he whispered. 1, I hand you over. 2, I kill you now. 3, I help you disappear. Hanna looked him directly in the eye. You will choose the 4th. There is no 4th. You will create it. His hands shook. He understood. Her escape was not about leaving the building. It was about changing the mental structure of the captor. She leaned forward slightly and whispered, You and I are no longer on opposite sides. He swallowed hard. And believed it. He unlocked her chains, even though she had never tried to flee. He hid her inside a supply cart when no one watched. He forged a transfer document under the identity of a mute textile worker. He walked beside the cart, hands steady, voice steady, breathing steady, mimicking normal routine so perfectly that no suspicion could anchor. Hanna remained utterly still inside, not tense, not afraid, but in absolute tactical silence, slowing even her heart rate to reduce sound resonance inside the metal. At the final checkpoint, a guard asked, Cargo? The investigator replied, Cloth waste for burning. The guard nodded, bored, waved them through. But then paused. Turn back. Can't burn today. Wind direction changed. Take it to storage. The investigator's pulse spiked, but his face didn't. Orders from Dr. Weiss. The guard rolled his eyes. Fine. Go. He let the cart pass. Only after they turned 2 corners and reached an unmonitored basement stairwell did the investigator unlock the hatch and whisper. Get out. She climbed out soundlessly. He expected gratitude. She gave him accuracy. This is not escape, she said. This is entry. He froze. Entry into what? She stepped into the shadows. The next phase. She turned back only once. And now, you are part of it. The stairwell air tasted like rust and dust, thick enough that every breath felt like inhaling the residue of forgotten screams. Hanna didn't flinch. She breathed as if the air belonged to her, as if she were adjusting her lungs to a new altitude rather than suffocating inside stone walls older than anyone living inside them. The investigator whispered urgently. We must move now. They count the carts every 90 minutes. Hanna didn't answer. She studied the stairwell as if observing the architecture of captivity itself. Not stone but structure, not walls but design. Her silence was no longer subtle rebellion. It had become strategy in motion. She finally said, calm as a surgeon, There is another exit they don't watch. The investigator frowned. No one escaped from this building. Not even in stories. How would you know that? She turned her head slowly, scanning the thick concrete, then pointed a small finger toward the far left wall. Because the walls are not symmetrical. He blinked. Most people use their eyes to see. Hanna used hers to calculate. He examined the wall she indicated and only now noticed. It was newer than the others. Slightly different shade. Different texture. Slightly shorter echo response if tapped. She placed her palm gently on it, not pushing, not knocking. Listening, using pressure, microvibrations through bone conduction. Then she whispered. There is hollow space. Something was sealed here. The investigator stepped forward, feeling as if the child had just reached inside the walls and rearranged reality. Even if you're right, he whispered, we have no tools. Hanna turned to him and answered with a tone that did not match her size or age. Tools only matter to those who don't understand leverage. She stepped toward a corroded drain cover at the floor's edge. With delicate fingers she slipped her nails into the lip and pulled upward, not with strength but with angle precision, forcing rust to fracture where it was weakest instead of where it resisted strongest. The cover lifted. Inside the drain lay a broken L-shaped metal hinge, rusted, jagged, useless to any normal prisoner. But Hanna didn't see scrap. She saw mechanics. She inserted the hinge between 2 small cracks in the newer wall and twisted slowly, not forcing forward but forcing expansion sideways, distributing tension until the first seam cracked with a faint, deep popping sound like ice shifting beneath heavy weight. The investigator stared. How did you know that would work? Because this wall was made in a hurry, she replied. Haste leaves repeating errors. She continued applying pressure at precise points, and within minutes, a narrow vertical panel loosened, revealing a hidden passage, A forgotten pre-war maintenance shaft, pitch black, narrow, almost invisible. This isn't an exit, he warned. It could lead deeper. All exits lead deeper before they lead out, she said, stepping inside. He hesitated before following. In the darkness, Hanna did not slow. She walked as if darkness illuminated thought instead of sight. Her footsteps never echoed. She placed them at angles that dispersed sound rather than reflected it. The investigator realized she wasn't walking silently. She was walking invisibly. They reached a junction where 3 tunnels diverged like the trident of some underground leviathan. The investigator froze. There were no markers, no airflow changes, no sound variation. Which way? Hanna closed her eyes and touched the ground with 2 fingers. Left tunnel slopes down 2 degrees. Right slopes up 5. Middle stays level. The investigator asked, baffled. How can you tell? Gravity always tells the truth, she murmured. He looked impressed and afraid. Which is the correct path? Hanna stood, eyes still closed. The one that leads people away from where they think freedom lies. She chose the middle tunnel. The investigator followed, trusting not logic but pattern intelligence, knowing that if the child ever chose wrong, she would notice it faster than anyone else. While Hanna disappeared into the belly of the structure, her absence in the camp did not create fear. It created alignment. Inside the ghetto, something had shifted beyond explanation. People woke up before roll call, standing silently in organized lines. No child cried at night anymore. Not one, and no one panicked when guards shouted. When an officer slapped a man, he didn't react, not with submission but with studied observation. They no longer behaved like cattle waiting to die. They behaved like individual nodes of a collective mind, sharing no words, yet functioning as if connected by invisible logic. Women whispered stories. She will return. She is not dead. She is not child, she is method. Men whispered something different. She is not escaping for herself. She is making structure. And guards whispered the most dangerous version. She is still here. We can feel her. Rumor became discomfort. Discomfort became fear. Fear became superstition. The tunnel twisted for minutes that felt like hours. At times, the walls narrowed enough that they were forced to turn sideways. At other points, the ground dipped into ankle-deep stagnant water so cold it felt like stepping into the memory of winter itself. The investigator finally whispered. How far does it go? Farther than anyone ever checked, she answered. How do you know? Because it's too quiet to be monitored. Then they reached something unexpected. A rusted iron ladder leading upward. Hanna checked the temperature of the metal by placing 2 fingers on it. This leads to outside air. The investigator watched, astonished. Metal touching wind cools differently than metal touching earth, she explained. They climbed. At the top, a wooden panel blocked the exit. No lock, only pressure holding it shut. Hanna pushed with her palm, slowly measuring resistance. Then she whispered. We are under the old crematorium. The words chilled the investigator deeper than the cold air. They climbed out into a storage room filled with sacks of coal, stacks of unused firewood, and buckets of kerosene. A supply shed no guard cared about as long as it produced flames when commanded. Why here? He asked. Hanna looked around. Because places built for destruction are the least guarded when they're not in use. Then she walked to the wall and traced her fingers across the boards. There is a window behind this. But it's covered, he said. Covered is not the same as sealed. She pulled a small coal chisel from the corner, placed for workers never noticed by guards, and wedged it between 2 boards, forcing them apart quietly. Cold wind rushed through the gap, the first taste of open air she'd felt in weeks. But she did not crawl out. Instead she whispered. Wait. The investigator looked panicked. Why? We can leave now. Hanna turned to him slowly. Escaping is not the goal. He froze. Then what is? She stared him dead center in the eyes. Activation. He didn't understand, but part of him knew not to argue. She walked to the coal sacks, tore one open, dipped her fingers inside and smeared 3 dark symbols on the floor. Not recognizable letters, not religious markings, but coordination sigils that only someone who had observed her before might interpret. They will know, she whispered. Not who, not what, but those aligned. Then she spoke words that didn't sound like request nor prayer but instruction. Let the quiet ones walk. The investigator whispered. So this is a message? Hanna nodded. Not a message. A protocol. She did not exit through the window. She backed away from it. Confused, the investigator asked. If not this way, then how? Hanna pointed to a trap door near the furnace, tiny, hidden under burned scraps. Workers brought ashes to the river. The tunnel leads there. He kneeled, lifted the hatch. Inside was a narrow sepia-colored chute descending into darkness and soil. It's barely wide enough for a child to fit, he warned. Exactly, she answered. She lowered herself inside, inch by inch, until only her face remained visible. The investigator looked down at her, voice shaking. What will you do now? She answered without emotion, without fear, without doubt. I will arrive where they cannot predict arrival. And with that she slipped down silently and vanished. No scream. No sound. No echo. Like smoke sinking instead of rising. The investigator stared down the chute for a full minute, mind shattered between awe and terror. Then he closed the hatch. Not out of betrayal, but to erase the path. Hanna crawled through the chute until it opened into wet earth smelling of clay and river mold. She followed the damp airflow until she reached a drainage grate. She listened. No patrol, no dogs, no movement. She pushed. The grate rose just enough. She slipped into the river silently, letting the icy water swallow her body so completely that even her breath moved like part of the current. She floated downstream, unseen, unheard, unquestioned, a living ghost carried by the same current that once carried ashes of the dead. But she did not let the water take her. She used it. When she reached a low branch near the riverbank, she grabbed it, pulled herself out and disappeared into the tree line, barefoot, dripping, silent. Within 48 hours everything changed. Search units formed, the maps were redrafted, guard shifts doubled. Rumors were banned, silence became forbidden. But silence had already spread. Soon prisoners began vanishing, not en masse, not chaotically. One every few nights. Always those who observed, never those who panicked. Sometimes they left signs, a board realigned. A loose brick. 3 faint fingerprints in coal dust. The guards called it the silent plague. But the prisoners called it something else. Hanna's path. Some said she communicated through taps and pipes. Some said she appeared only where decisions were being formed. Some said she was no longer seen, only understood. And then came the testimonies. A Polish farmer swore he saw a drenched child walking the forest edge without leaving footprints. A German doctor claimed he lost 3 patients who slipped out of locked rooms without opening doors. A captured soldier whispered that orders changed in his mind after seeing a girl with emotionless eyes. No story matched. All stories aligned. Years after the war, when all camps were liberated and documents archived, a file surfaced. Unsigned, untranslated, written in tight, unbroken script. She did not escape the camp. She escaped the concept of confinement. And below it, one final untraceable sentence. When systems become prisons, she becomes silence. To this day, in survivor communities across Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Belarus, people still murmur one forbidden sentence whenever a person disappears unexpectedly under oppressive control. The silent blade has chosen another exit. Because legends do not end. They shift forms. And she was never a girl. She was the blueprint of uncontainable minds.